My father locked my mother in a room for 3 days because she gained half a pound, then thanked him for helping her stay beautiful. When I asked him how he could do that, he said, "We were keeping you healthy." I stayed silent. That was years ago. This morning, he was standing outside my apartment in tears. In my house, women got weighed every morning at 6 a.m. sharp. If you gained even half a pound, you were locked in the empty bedroom without food until you lost it. My mom spent 3 days in there once because she retained water during her period. When she came out, her lips were cracked and she could barely stand, but she smiled and thanked my father for helping her stay beautiful. I was just 8 years old at the time, and I thought that's just how life was. So by the time I turned 15, I'd seen my sister pass out twice, my cousin sneaking water from the bathroom tap, and my aunt teaching her daughter to make herself throw up after family dinners. The men would eat full plates while we picked at salads, calculating every bite. The rules were simple. Step on the scale every morning in front of your father or husband. If the number went up, you went to the room. No exceptions, no excuses. Except, of course, for pregnancy. But even then, you had 6 weeks after birth to get back to your marriage weight, or you'd be sent back to the room. And one day, I was graced with something beautiful. Not pregnancy. It was a hobby. Wrestling. Because it was wrestling season at school, and that's when I had my light bulb moment. I watched boys dropping 5 pounds overnight for weigh-ins using water manipulation. They'd dehydrate before weighing, then rehydrate after. It was dangerous, but it was temporary. I became obsessed with weight manipulation techniques. Caffeine pills as diuretics, helps you pee more. The exact timing of water intake. How to drop 3 pounds overnight and gain it back by noon without anyone noticing. But I couldn't keep this to myself. Not when my 12-year-old cousin was crying with hunger every day. Not when my sister was losing her hair from malnutrition. So I started a sewing circle every Thursday afternoon, teaching the girls in my family to embroider. Except between the stitches, I taught them other things. How to use natural diuretics the night before weigh-ins. How to wake up at 4 a.m. to sweat in garbage bags, then shower before the 6 a.m. weigh-in. How to use those hydration packets to put into your water afterwards. We got scientific about it. Tracking our cycles to know when we'd retain water. Taking measurements to prove we weren't actually gaining fat even if the scale fluctuated. Some girls learned to manipulate their weight by 5 pounds in either direction, eating full meals while still hitting their morning numbers, all to avoid the room. But I taught them something else too. How to document everything. I showed them how to take photos of the scale readings, how to record the sound of locks clicking, how to hide phones in the punishment room. We kept medical records showing the dangerous dehydration cycles we were forcing on our bodies. 6 months into our sewing circle, everything fell apart. I'd taught the girls to reprogram digital scales using magnets, making them read 5 pounds lighter. It was supposed to be foolproof. We'd all been eating normally for weeks while our fathers praised our discipline, but my uncle bought a new scale, a mechanical one, old-fashioned, no electronics to hack. That morning, every woman in the house was 5 pounds over. The men went insane. They thought we'd coordinated some kind of rebellion. As they dragged girl after girl to the punishment rooms, they had to use bedrooms, closets, the basement, because there weren't enough official rooms. My 13-year-old cousin started screaming, "We haven't gained weight. We've been faking the numbers. We've been eating this whole time." She pulled out her phone, showing months of documentation, real weights versus manipulated ones, the scale hacking tutorials, everything. The room went silent. My uncle's face turned purple as he scrolled through her phone. Screenshots of our group chat, videos of us teaching each other to reprogram scales, time-stamped photos showing girls eating full dinners while their morning weigh-ins showed losses. "You poisonous little..." He raised his hand to strike her, but that's when my grandmother stepped forward. My grandmother, who we thought had dementia, who shuffled around the house, barely speaking. She grabbed my uncle's wrist with surprising strength. "Enough," she said, her voice clear and sharp. "I've been documenting too." She pulled out a smartphone none of us knew she had. 3 years of evidence. Every punishment, every medical emergency, every girl who ended up in the hospital. She turned to us girls. "Did you really think you were the first generation to try this? I've been building a case since before you were born. Your mothers tried to fight back too. They failed. But now," she smiled, "now we have enough evidence for 3 generations of abuse." My uncle lunged for her phone, but she'd already hit send. "It's uploaded to my lawyer, and the police, and..." She glanced at my cousin's phone, still recording, apparently the internet. That's when we heard the sirens. My cousin smiled through her tears. "I've been live streaming for the past 10 minutes. The live stream notification sound kept pinging from my cousin's phone as more viewers joined. My uncle's face twisted between rage and panic, his hands clenching and unclenching as he processed what was happening. The other men in the room froze, their usual authority crumbling as they realized thousands of strangers were witnessing their private family system. My father grabbed for my cousin's phone, but she tossed it to me. I caught it and backed toward the kitchen, keeping the camera on them. The viewer count climbed past 10,000. Comments flooded the screen faster than I could read them. My hands shook, but I kept recording. "Turn it off," my father commanded, using the voice that usually made us all comply instantly. But something had shifted. The power dynamic we'd lived under for generations was fracturing in real time. My grandmother moved between us and the men, her small frame suddenly seeming larger. She held her own phone steady, documenting their reactions. My mother and aunts huddled together near the punishment room door, some crying, others staring in shock at this unprecedented defiance. The sirens grew louder. My uncle made another lunge for the phones, knocking over a lamp in his desperation. The crash made several of the younger girls scream. My 12-year-old cousin ran to hide behind her older sister, both of them trembling. "You've destroyed this family," my uncle spat at my grandmother. "Generations of tradition, of discipline, gone because of your poison." My grandmother's laugh was sharp and bitter. "I've saved this family. You just can't see it yet." The doorbell rang, then pounding. "Police! Open up!" My father moved toward the door, then stopped, realizing that opening it would mean admitting officers into our home while a live stream showed everything. The pounding intensified. Through the window, I could see multiple patrol cars, their lights painting our living room walls in alternating red and blue. My uncle turned his fury on me. "You started this with your little weight tricks, teaching them to cheat the system." I kept the phone steady, though my whole body trembled. "I taught them to survive your system." More pounding. The door frame shook. My grandmother walked calmly to open it, but my uncle blocked her path. They stood face to face, decades of hidden conflict finally surfacing. She met his glare without flinching. "Move, or I'll add assault to the list of charges," she said quietly. immediately. The viewer count hit 50,000. Comments demanding someone call child services, asking for our address, expressing horror at what they were witnessing. My cousin had been smart to keep our location vague in her username. My uncle's wife, my aunt who had taught her daughter to purge after meals, suddenly spoke up. Let them in. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the tense silence, everyone heard her. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. Her husband whirled on her. You're my wife. You stand with me. She shook her head, tears streaming. I've stood with you for 15 years. I've starved myself. Watched my daughter starve. No more. The police gave a final warning before the door burst open. Officers flooded in, taking in the scene, the cowering women and girls, the angry men, the phones recording everything. They quickly separated everyone, moving the men to one side of the room. A female officer approached my grandmother first, recognizing her as the one who'd called. They spoke in low voices while my grandmother showed her phone, presumably the evidence she'd collected. The officer's expression grew increasingly grim as she scrolled through years of documentation. My uncle tried to explain to another officer, his voice switching to reasonable and calm. This is a family matter. We have certain household rules about health and fitness. These women are being dramatic. The officer looked at the punishment room, its door still open, showing the bare mattress and empty walls. Then at my mother's hollow cheeks, my sister's thinning hair, the way all of us women seemed to shrink into ourselves when the men moved. We'll need to interview everyone separately, the officer announced. My grandmother nodded. The girls have medical records, malnutrition, dehydration, electrolyte imbalances. It's all documented. The live stream kept running. I saw comments from people sharing their own stories, expressing solidarity. Some claimed to be calling local news stations. The viewer count passed 100,000. My cousin's phone battery warning flashed red. My father finally spoke to me directly. You've shamed our family in front of the world. How could you do this? I found my voice, steadier now with the police present. How could you lock mom in a room for 3 days? How could you watch your daughter pass out from hunger? We were keeping you healthy, he insisted. But even he seemed to realize how hollow it sounded with police officers documenting the punishment room. My grandmother pulled out a folder from behind a picture frame, another hiding spot none of us had known about. Hospital records, she announced. Every time one of us was admitted for dehydration or exhaustion, every fracture from calcium deficiency, every case of amenorrhea from low body weight. The men had no response to medical evidence. Their system had relied on isolation, on making us believe this was normal. But here, with strangers watching, with police taking notes, with documentation spanning years, their control evaporated. More family members began speaking up. My aunt admitted she'd been hospitalized twice for kidney problems from chronic dehydration. My oldest cousin revealed she'd been trying to get pregnant for 3 years, but couldn't because her body weight was too low. Stories poured out that we'd never shared with each other, each woman thinking she was alone in her suffering. The female officer coordinating the scene called for additional units and social services. We'll need to process this house as a crime scene, she announced. Everyone will need to come to the station for formal statements. My uncle made one last attempt at control. You can't arrest us for having household rules. This is America. A man has the right to run his home. Not like this, the officer replied firmly. What you've described and what we're seeing constitutes systematic abuse. As they began leading the men out, my father looked back at me. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not anger, not disappointment, but actual fear. The power structure that had defined our family for generations was crumbling, and he knew it. My grandmother gathered us younger girls together. This is just the beginning, she warned quietly. They'll try to regain control. They'll use lawyers, manipulation, family pressure. Some of your mothers might even side with them out of fear or habit. You need to be prepared. She was right. Even as the police cars pulled away, I could see my uncle on his phone, probably calling lawyers. This wasn't over. The live stream had exposed our secret, but exposing it and ending it were two different things. My cousin's phone finally died, ending the broadcast, but the damage was done, or rather, the healing had begun. For the first time in our lives, we'd spoken our truth to the world. The weight that had controlled us for so long suddenly seemed less crushing. As we prepared to go to the station, I looked around at my family. Some of the women looked terrified, others relieved. The younger girls clung to their mothers or older sisters. We were all processing the magnitude of what had just happened. My grandmother squeezed my hand. You did good with the weight manipulation tricks. Gave them something to focus on besides the real documentation we were building. Sometimes the best rebellion is the one that looks like compliance. I realized she'd known about our sewing circle all along. While we thought we were secretly teaching each other to cheat the scales, she'd been using our activities as cover for her own evidence gathering. Generations of strategic thinking, all leading to this moment. But as we filed out of the house, I knew she was right about what came next. The men wouldn't give up easily. They'd been raised in this system too, taught that controlling women's bodies was their birthright. They'd use every tool at their disposal to maintain that control. The real fight was just beginning. But for the first time, we weren't fighting alone. We had each other, we had evidence, and thanks to my cousin's quick thinking, we had thousands of witnesses. The weight we'd carried wasn't just physical. It was generational trauma, systematic control, and learned helplessness. But that morning, as we walked out of that house with police escorts, some of that weight began to lift. We were free from the morning weigh-ins, free from the punishment room, free from the constant hunger. But freedom, I was learning, was more complicated than just walking away. It meant learning to eat without guilt, to exist in our bodies without shame, to make choices without fear. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but we'd taken the first step, and that was everything. The police station became our temporary refuge, though the fluorescent lights made everyone look sicker than they already were. I watched my mother fill out paperwork with shaking hands while my sister sat beside her, both of them jumping whenever a door slammed. The female officer who'd taken my grandmother's evidence kept checking on us, bringing water bottles and granola bars that most of the women were too nervous to touch. My grandmother orchestrated everything from her plastic chair like a general commanding troops. She directed which girls should give statements first, reminded everyone to mention specific medical incidents, and kept meticulous notes of her own. I realized she'd been preparing for this moment for years, maybe decades. The men were processed separately, but we could hear my uncle's voice carrying through the walls, alternating between outrage and calculated charm. My father remained silent, which worried me more than any shouting would have. He'd always been the strategist, the one who thought 3 moves ahead. After 4 hours of statements and documentation, they released us all. The men had to post bail, but there were no immediate charges filed. The officer explained that building a case would take time, that the evidence needed to be properly reviewed. My grandmother nodded as if she'd expected this, but I saw the younger girls' faces fall. They'd thought the police would fix everything immediately. We couldn't go back to the house, not with it being processed as a crime scene. My grandmother had anticipated this too. She'd been secretly renting a small apartment across town for the past 6 months, paying cash, keeping it ready. She handed out keys she'd had made, and we caravanned there in borrowed cars and ride shares. The apartment was cramped but stocked with essentials. 23 women and girls crowded into a 2-bedroom space meant for maybe 4 people. We spread out sleeping bags and blankets on every available surface. My grandmother had even hidden protein bars and meal replacement shakes in the closets, knowing we'd need to rebuild our strength. That first night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking my phone, watching the view count on the dead live stream climb. Screenshots were spreading across social media. People were sharing their own stories of family control and abuse. But I also saw the backlash starting. Comments calling us liars, saying we were ungrateful, that men had the right to keep their families healthy. My uncle must have found allies online already. The next morning brought our first betrayal. My Aunt Catherine, my father's sister who'd always seemed sympathetic to our suffering, showed up at the apartment before dawn. She knocked softly, and when my grandmother answered, Catherine pushed inside with tears streaming down her face. She fell to her knees in the tiny living room, waking everyone with her sobs. She begged forgiveness, said she'd been weak, that she'd never meant for things to go so far. My grandmother's face hardened as Catherine confessed that she'd given our location to the men. They were coming. The apartment erupted in panic. Girls scrambled for their shoes, mothers clutched their daughters, everyone talking at once about where to run. But my grandmother held up her hand for silence. She'd expected this too. Catherine had always been the weakest link, too dependent on her husband's approval to fully commit to resistance. My grandmother made Catherine call her husband back, putting the phone on speaker. We all heard my uncle's voice, smooth and confident, saying they just wanted to talk, to work things out as a family. They'd be there in 20 minutes to collect their wives and daughters. No police this time, just a family discussion. After Catherine hung up, my grandmother revealed her next move. She'd installed security cameras in the apartment hallway and doorway. Everything would be recorded. If the men tried to force us to leave, we'd have evidence. But she warned us that they'd likely use other tactics first. Emotional manipulation was their strongest weapon. We had minutes to prepare. My grandmother assigned roles like a director blocking a scene. The youngest girls would hide in the back bedroom with 2 of the stronger mothers guarding the door. The rest of us would form a human barrier in the living room. Most importantly, multiple phones would be recording from different angles. Catherine crumbled completely. Realizing she'd been used as a pawn, she begged to help, to make amends. My grandmother studied her for a long moment before assigning her a crucial task. She would answer the door and try to keep the men in the hallway as long as possible, giving us time to position ourselves. The knock came exactly 20 minutes later. Catherine opened the door with shaking hands. My father stood there with my uncle and 3 other men from our extended family. They'd dressed carefully, looking respectable and concerned rather than angry. My father even carried a bouquet of flowers. Catherine tried to block the doorway, stammering about needing more time, but my uncle gently moved her aside. They filed into the apartment, taking in the crowded conditions with expressions of exaggerated concern. My father's eyes found mine immediately, and I saw his strategy shifting as he assessed our defensive positions. He approached slowly, holding out the flowers toward my mother. She stood frozen between my grandmother and my sister, unable to move. He spoke softly about forgiveness, about family unity, about how we could work through this together. His voice was honey sweet, the tone he'd used throughout my childhood to make punishments seem like love. My uncle took a different approach, expressing shock at our living conditions. How could we subject the children to sleeping on floors? What kind of example were we setting? He pulled out his wallet, offering to pay for a hotel, separate rooms for everyone to have space and privacy. All we had to do was come with them to discuss terms. The other men spread out, each targeting specific women. They knew exactly which buttons to push. One reminded his wife about their daughter's upcoming birthday party, already planned and paid for. Another mentioned his wife's elderly mother, who'd been asking where everyone was. They painted pictures of normal life waiting just beyond our resistance. My youngest cousin, only 10 years old, peeked out from the bedroom despite orders to stay hidden. Her father's face lit up with genuine seeming joy. He dropped to his knees, arms open, calling her his princess. She took a step forward before her older sister yanked her back, slamming the bedroom door. The rejection cracked their calm facades. My uncle's voice hardened as he pointed out that we couldn't stay here forever. 23 people in a 2-bedroom apartment would violate occupancy codes. He'd already called the landlord to express concern. Did we want to be evicted? To have that on our records? My father tried another tactic, focusing on the practical. How would we support ourselves? Most of the women had never worked, had no credit history, no savings. He controlled all the bank accounts, the car titles, the health insurance. Did we plan to raise our daughters in poverty just to prove a point? That's when my grandmother played her next card. She pulled out a folder thick with documents, bank statements from accounts the men didn't know about, jobs she'd helped women secure secretly over the years, a paper trail of financial abuse that would ensure favorable divorce settlements. She'd been planning this for longer than any of us had imagined. The men's composure finally cracked. My uncle lunged for the folder, but 3 women blocked him. He grabbed Catherine's wrist instead, twisting it until she cried out. The cameras captured everything. He realized his mistake immediately, releasing her and stepping back, but the damage was done. My father tried to salvage the situation, suggesting we were all emotional and needed time to calm down. He proposed a compromise. The women could stay in the apartment for a week to think things over, but the girls should come home where they'd be properly cared for. The mothers could visit anytime they wanted. Several mothers wavered at this. The apartment was cramped, resources were limited, and they'd been conditioned to believe they couldn't properly care for their children without their husband's support. I saw the doubt creeping across faces, the old programming reasserting itself. That's when I remembered something from my wrestling research. Psychological warfare worked both ways. I pulled out my phone and started reading from a medical website about the long-term effects of childhood malnutrition, stunted growth, cognitive impairment, organ damage. I listed listed every girl in our family who'd been hospitalized, every diagnosis directly traceable to our father's rules. My sister joined in, rolling up her sleeves to show the scars from when she'd passed out and hit the corner of a table. My cousin displayed her thinning hair, pulling out clumps to demonstrate the ongoing damage. One by one, the girls presented evidence of what proper care had meant in our family. The mother's resolve hardened again. They formed a tighter barrier between the men and their daughters. My uncle made one last attempt, promising changes, counseling, whatever we wanted, but his phone rang before he could finish. The landlord was in the parking lot, responding to his earlier call about occupancy violations. My grandmother smiled. She'd anticipated this too. The lease was in her name alone, and she'd already cleared our temporary situation with the actual property owner, not the management company my uncle had contacted. The landlord downstairs was actually a social worker she'd been coordinating with, ready to document any attempts at forced removal. Cornered and outmaneuvered, the men had no choice but to retreat. My father locked eyes with me one last time before leaving. The look promised this wasn't over. They'd regroup, find new angles, apply different pressures. The war for our family's future had only just begun. After they left, we discovered Catherine had been recording audio on her phone the entire time, her small attempt at redemption. My grandmother added it to her ever-growing evidence file, but she warned us not to get comfortable. The men would escalate. They always did when their control was threatened. The next few days blurred together in a haze of survival logistics. We established routines in our cramped quarters, rationing food and bathroom time. My grandmother coordinated with lawyers, social workers, and domestic violence advocates. She'd built an entire network of support we'd never known existed, but the men were building their own network. My cousin monitoring social media showed me the narrative they were crafting online. We were rebellious women influenced by radical feminism. They were loving fathers and husbands trying to save their families from a cult-like grandmother. They posted old photos of happy family gatherings, carefully cropped to hide our hollow cheeks and tired eyes. The pressure campaign intensified. Extended family members we hadn't seen in years suddenly called, expressing concern. Former family friends reached out with offers of mediation. Even our old pastor left voicemails about the sanctity of marriage and family unity. Each contact was carefully orchestrated to wear down our resolve. Then came the financial assault. Bank accounts were frozen, credit cards canceled, insurance policies terminated, cars reported stolen. The men knew exactly how to weaponize the system they'd used to control us. Several women panicked as they realized they couldn't access money for their children's medications or basic necessities. My grandmother revealed another contingency plan. She'd been slowly moving money into a trust for years, tiny amounts that wouldn't be noticed. She'd also helped several women establish credit in their maiden names through secured cards. It wasn't much, but it would keep us afloat while the lawyers worked on unfreezing assets. The stress was taking its toll. Arguments broke out over food, sleeping arrangements, and childcare. Some women talked about going back, just temporarily, just until things were sorted out legally. Others wanted to flee the state entirely. The united front we'd presented was developing cracks. That's when the real betrayal came. My Aunt Cebe, who'd been one of the strongest advocates for leaving, disappeared one night with her 2 daughters. She left a note saying she couldn't do this to her children, that maybe the men would be more reasonable now that they'd made their point. Her defection devastated morale. If Cebe could break, anyone could. The women eyed each other with new suspicion. Who would be next? Who was secretly in contact with their husbands? The paranoia was exactly what the men wanted. My grandmother called a meeting. She reminded us that this was a marathon, not a sprint. The men were using classic abuse tactics: isolation, financial control, emotional manipulation, and divide and conquer strategies. But we had something they didn't expect: documentation, legal support, and each other. She assigned us projects to maintain focus. Some women started job hunting, others worked on divorce paperwork. The teenagers helped younger girls with homework, maintaining some normalcy. I became the unofficial social media manager, countering the men's narrative with our own truth. But I also had a secret mission. My grandmother pulled me aside one evening and handed me a burner phone. She needed someone to maintain contact with the women who were wavering, to be a lifeline if they decided to leave again. I became a double agent of sorts, pretending to sympathize with doubts while reinforcing why we'd left. The first test came sooner than expected. My mother received a message through a flying monkey relative. My father was in the hospital. Heart problems, they said. He was asking for her, might not make it through the night. The emotional manipulation was obvious, but my mother's conditioning ran deep. I went with her to the hospital, both for support and surveillance. My father lay in the bed, looking genuinely ill but not critical. He reached for my mother's hand, tears in his eyes, apologizing for everything. He promised changes, therapy, whatever it took. He just couldn't bear to die without his family. My mother wavered, her hand hovering over his. I saw the years of programming warring with newfound freedom. Then I noticed the heart monitor. The numbers were too steady for someone supposedly dying. I'd learned to read medical equipment during our documentation phase. I whispered this observation to my mother. Her hand withdrew. She told my father she hoped he recovered, but that she wouldn't be returning. His facade cracked, and he grabbed her wrist. Security had to be called. We left with another piece of evidence: the medical records showing he'd been admitted for anxiety, not heart problems. Back at the apartment, word of the fake medical emergency spread. It strengthened resolve in some, but deepened fear in others. If the men would fake illness, what else would they do? The answer came within days. Child Protective Services showed up, responding to anonymous reports of neglect and overcrowding. My grandmother was ready with documentation showing our temporary situation, the social worker's approval, and evidence of the abuse we'd fled. But the investigation itself was traumatic, especially for the younger girls who'd already been through so much. The men's strategy was clear. If they couldn't force us back, they'd make our new life so difficult we'd return voluntarily. Every system designed to protect us was being weaponized against us. The investigations, while ultimately unfounded, drained our resources and energy. Some women began meeting with their husbands secretly, trying to negotiate individual returns. The unity we'd fought so hard to maintain was fracturing. My grandmother didn't judge them. She'd seen this pattern before. Some would go back. Others would find the strength to stay. The important thing was that they now knew escape was possible. I focused on damage control, documenting every interaction, every threat, every manipulation. The file grew thicker daily, but I also also watched the toll it was taking on everyone, especially my grandmother. She'd been fighting this fight for decades, and the stress was showing. One evening, while most everyone slept, I found her on the apartment's tiny balcony, looking older than I'd ever seen her. She told me about her own mother, who'd tried to escape once but had been dragged back, about the aunt who'd succeeded in leaving but had been cut off from her children forever, about all the women who'd tried and failed before us. She also told me why she'd stayed and played the long game. She'd realized that individual escape wasn't enough. The system would continue with the next generation. She'd dedicated her life to documenting everything, waiting for the right moment, the right technology, the right combination of brave girls willing to fight. That conversation strengthened my resolve. We weren't just fighting for ourselves, but for every girl who would come after us. The men might have money, connections, and systemic advantages, but we had truth, documentation, and the kind of determination that only comes from fighting for survival. As weeks turned into a month, patterns emerged. The men would escalate their tactics whenever we gained ground legally. Every small victory in court was met with new forms of harassment, but we were learning too, anticipating their moves, preparing counters. The apartment became a war room. Charts tracking legal proceedings covered one wall. Schedules for job interviews and school enrollments covered another. We were building new lives piece by piece, even as we fought to dismantle the old ones. Some women did leave, unable to withstand the pressure. We hugged them goodbye without judgment, giving them burner phones and promises of support if they needed to escape again. Others arrived, relatives who'd heard about our stand and found their own courage. The numbers fluctuated, but the core group solidified. My role evolved from documentarian to strategist. I studied patterns in the men's behavior, predicting their next moves with increasing accuracy. I learned which judges were sympathetic to our cause and which ones shared the men's worldview. I mapped out connections between the men's supporters, identifying weak links we could potentially turn. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. CB, who'd returned to her husband weeks earlier, reached out through the burner phone network. She'd gone back as a spy, documenting her husband's planning sessions with the other men. She'd recorded conversations about hiding assets, coaching each other on legal strategies, and planning their next pressure tactics. Her intelligence was invaluable. We knew about the private investigator before he started following us. We anticipated the attempt to have my grandmother declared mentally incompetent. We prepared for the coordinated effort to influence our divorce judges. Each scheme failed because we were ready. But the men were getting desperate. Their controlled, calculating approach was giving way to rage. The masks they'd worn for the public were slipping. Some made threats in writing. Others showed up at job interviews to sabotage employment opportunities. One tried to kidnap his daughter from school. Each escalation provided more evidence, but also more trauma. The younger girls were developing anxiety disorders. Some women couldn't sleep, jumping at every noise. The cost of freedom was higher than any of us had anticipated, but still less than the cost of staying. My grandmother's health declined further. The stress of coordinating everything while fighting her own legal battles was taking its toll. I took on more responsibilities, becoming her unofficial deputy. She taught me everything she knew about navigating systems, building networks, and maintaining hope in the face of systematic oppression. The turning point came during a custody hearing. My uncle, frustrated by legal setbacks, lost his temper in front of the judge. He revealed his true beliefs about women's place, about his right to control his family, about how the system was failing men like him. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to concerned. That outburst triggered a domino effect. Other judges began looking more carefully at our evidence. Social workers started taking our claims more seriously. The narrative the men had crafted began to crumble under scrutiny. Their masks had slipped too many times. But victory wasn't sudden or complete. It came in small doses. A restraining order here, a favorable custody ruling there. Each win was hard-fought and partial. The men regrouped after each loss, trying new tactics, finding new allies. The war of attrition continued. Some women grew strong in the fight. They found jobs, started therapy, began healing from years of abuse. Their daughters watched them transform, learning that resistance was possible. Other women struggled, the programming too deep to fully overcome. They lived in a constant state of fear, freedom feeling more like another form of captivity. I watched my own mother's journey with mixed emotions. Some days she was strong, making plans for a future she'd never imagined possible. Other days, she'd stare at her phone, finger hovering over my father's number. The deprogramming process wasn't linear. It was full of setbacks and small victories. My sister surprised everyone by emerging as a fierce advocate. She started a support group for teenage girls escaping family abuse. Her own experience with malnutrition became a powerful testimony. She transformed her trauma into purpose, helping others recognize the signs of systematic control. The men's alliance began to fracture. Some faced serious legal consequences and blamed others for the exposure. Financial pressure mounted as they paid for lawyers while losing control of family assets. The unified front they'd presented started showing cracks. We received word that two of the men were turning on each other, each trying to minimize their own involvement by highlighting the other's abuse. Their lawyers advised them to settle rather than risk criminal charges. The system they'd used to control us was slowly turning against them. But the core group, my father and uncle, remained defiant. They adapted their tactics, portraying themselves as victims of a feminist conspiracy. They found online communities of men who'd lost their families to similar escapes. They weren't giving up, they were evolving. My grandmother warned us that this was the most dangerous phase. Cornered abusers often escalated to violence. We increased security measures, varied our routines, and maintained vigilance. The apartment felt more like a bunker than a home, but it kept us safe. Through it all, I documented everything. The story that had started with a live stream had become a comprehensive archive of systematic abuse and resistance. Lawyers used our documentation in court. Researchers contacted us about studying our case. Our story was becoming bigger than just our family, but we couldn't lose sight of the individual battles within the larger war. Each woman's journey was unique. Each child's trauma required different healing. We were a collective, but we were also individuals trying to rebuild shattered lives. As another month passed, the apartment grew more organized, but also more strained. We needed more permanent solutions. Some women were ready to move into their own places, but fear kept them close. Others needed the continued support, but felt guilty about taking resources. My grandmother, despite her declining health, orchestrated a gradual transition transition. Women who were ready moved into nearby apartments, staying close enough for support but gaining independence. The network evolved from a single safe house to a community of survivors. The men's response was predictable. They targeted women who lived alone, thinking them more vulnerable. But we'd learned to work as a network. When one woman faced harassment, others rallied. When someone weakened, support arrived. We'd internalized the lessons of collective resistance. I became a liaison between generations, helping older women navigate technology while learning from their decades of survival strategies. The fusion of old wisdom and new tools made us formidable opponents. The men had underestimated us, thinking generations of oppression had made us weak. Instead, it had made us resilient. The financial battles intensified. Forensic accountants uncovered hidden assets, years of financial abuse documented in spreadsheets and bank records. The men had been meticulous in their control, but sloppy in their concealment. Their assumption that we'd never fight back had made them careless. Each legal victory brought mixed emotions. Joy at progress, but sadness at what we'd lost. Years of our lives spent under control. Health damaged by malnutrition. Dreams deferred or abandoned. Justice couldn't restore what had been taken, only prevent future harm. The younger girls adapted fastest, resilient in the way only children can be. They started school, made friends, discovered interests beyond survival. Watching them bloom in freedom justified every hardship. They were the reason we couldn't give up, but the cost was evident everywhere. Therapy bills mounted, medical treatments for years of neglect drained resources, legal fees consumed settlements. Freedom was expensive in ways we hadn't anticipated. Some women wondered if the fight was worth it. My grandmother's answer never wavered. She pulled out photos of previous generations, women who'd suffered in silence, who'd died young from the stress of constant control. She reminded us that we were breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. The cost was high, but the alternative was higher. As winter approached, our situation stabilized but remained tense. Court dates loomed. Custody battles continued. The men maintained their harassment campaigns, though legal consequences had made them more subtle. We existed in a state of armed truce, neither side able to claim complete victory. I realized this might be our reality for years. The complete freedom we'd imagined might never materialize. Instead, we'd carved out a space of relative safety, a beachhead in an ongoing war. It wasn't the dramatic victory we'd hoped for, but it was survival, and that was its own form of triumph. My grandmother pulled me aside one evening with a final piece of wisdom. She showed me letters from women who'd escaped decades ago, who'd built new lives, raised free daughters. They'd fought similar battles, faced similar setbacks, but ultimately prevailed. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through persistent resistance. The live stream that had started everything felt like a lifetime ago. That moment of desperate revelation had launched us into a war we hadn't fully understood, but we'd learned, adapted, survived. The girl who'd taught weight manipulation tricks had become a woman who understood that freedom itself required constant vigilance. As I looked around the apartment at the women preparing dinner, helping children with homework, planning for futures they'd never imagined possible, I realized we'd already won the most important battle. We'd proven that escape was possible. Everything else was just details. The men would continue their tactics. We'd continue our resistance. The war would evolve, but not end. And somewhere, another girl was learning that the scale in her bathroom was a weapon used against her. When she was ready, we'd be here. Proof that the weight of oppression could be lifted. My grandmother squeezed my hand, passing the torch she'd carried for so long. The fight wasn't over. It might never be truly over, but we'd changed the battlefield forever. The systematic control that had seemed unbreakable had been exposed, documented, resisted. Future generations would know that the morning weigh-ins could be refused, that the punishment room could be escaped, that the weight of generations could be lifted. The real victory wasn't in the legal battles or the financial settlements. It was in the transformation I saw in every woman who'd found the courage to step on a scale without fear, to eat a meal without calculating, to exist in her body without shame. We'd reclaimed ourselves, and that was a triumph no man could ever take away. The next morning brought a new crisis. My grandmother collapsed in the bathroom, her body finally giving out from months of stress. I caught her before she hit the floor, her weight almost nothing in my arms. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but the paramedics' faces told us what we already feared. Years of fighting had taken their toll. At the hospital, doctors ran tests while we crowded the waiting room. My mother paced endlessly, wringing her hands. My sister organized everyone into shifts, making sure someone would always be with our grandmother. The younger girls huddled together, understanding that our strongest pillar was crumbling. The diagnosis came back severe. Stress-induced heart problems, kidney damage from years of dehydration, solidarity with us, malnutrition complications. The doctor explained that recovery would be long and uncertain. My grandmother needed immediate surgery, then months of rehabilitation. The medical bills would be astronomical. My father appeared in the hospital corridor that afternoon. Security moved to intercept him, but he held up his hands peacefully. He'd brought insurance paperwork, offering to cover my grandmother's treatment if we'd just talk. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for the documents before pulling back. We all knew his help came with chains attached. The men had found their perfect leverage. Without insurance, my grandmother's care would bankrupt us. With it, we'd owe them. They'd orchestrated this moment carefully, waiting for our weakest point. My uncle arrived an hour later with more relatives, all expressing concern, all offering conditional help. That evening, I discovered something while sorting through my grandmother's belongings for her hospital stay. Hidden in her med organizer were USB drives, each labeled with dates going back years. I plugged one into my laptop and found recordings I'd never known existed. Videos of previous generations attempting escape, women who'd tried and failed. Their stories were our stories, repeated across decades. One video showed my grandmother as a young woman, teaching her daughters the same weight manipulation tricks I'd later discovered. The cycle had been repeating far longer than any of us realized. Each generation thought they were the first to resist, not knowing they were following patterns established by their grandmothers. Armed with this new evidence, I called an emergency meeting in the hospital cafeteria. The women gathered, exhausted from maintaining vigil over my grandmother. I showed them the videos, the proof that our fight was part of something larger. Some cried, seeing their mothers or grandmothers young and hopeful before the system broke them. My cousin who'd started the live stream had an idea. She'd been contacted by a documentary filmmaker filmmaker interested in our story. We'd refused all media attention, following my grandmother's instructions to keep this within the family. But what if we used their resources differently? Not for fame or exposure, but for leverage against the men. We crafted a careful plan. The filmmaker would create a private documentary using my grandmother's archived footage and our current situation. We wouldn't release it publicly, but its mere existence would be our insurance policy. If the men continued their harassment, if they tried to force us back, we'd have a completed film ready to destroy their reputations. The men discovered our plan within days. Their response was swift and brutal. They filed for emergency custody of all minor children, claiming we were exploiting them for profit. They froze more assets, canceled more insurance policies. They even got Catherine to testify that we were planning to sell our story to the highest bidder. The custody hearing was scheduled for the same day as my grandmother's surgery. We had to split up, some staying with her, others fighting for our children. In the courthouse, my father presented himself as a concerned parent, trying to protect his daughters from exploitation. He'd hired the best lawyers, coached witnesses, prepared for months, but we'd prepared too. CB's recordings from inside their planning sessions became crucial evidence. The judge heard my uncle coaching my father on how to appear sympathetic, discussing which judges could be influenced, planning financial attacks. Their own words condemned them more effectively than we ever could. During a recess, my father cornered me in the hallway. He dropped his public persona completely, revealing the desperate man underneath. He offered me a deal. If I convinced the others to drop everything, to come home, he'd ensure my grandmother got the best care. He'd even allow some changes to the weight rules. All I had to do was betray the women who'd become my family. I walked away without responding, but his offer haunted me. My grandmother was dying. The younger girls were suffering. Maybe compromise was better than mutual destruction. That night, I found myself standing outside my childhood home, key in hand, wondering if I was strong enough to resist the pull of familiar chains. My sister found me there. She didn't judge or lecture. Instead, she showed me messages from the younger cousins, girls who'd started eating normally for the first time in their lives. Photos of them laughing, playing sports, existing in their bodies without fear. Their freedom was the answer to my father's offer. The judge's ruling came down split. The men retained some custody rights, but with strict supervision. Our evidence of systematic abuse wasn't enough to sever their connections completely, but it was enough to ensure they couldn't enforce their rules anymore. The weight requirements were specifically forbidden in the custody agreement. My grandmother survived her surgery but remained weak. We moved her to a rehabilitation facility, taking turns visiting. She could barely speak, but her eyes remained sharp. During one visit, she grabbed my hand and pulled me close. Through labored breathing, she told me where to find one last piece of evidence. Hidden in a safety deposit box was documentation going back 60 years, marriage certificates showing patterns of young brides, death certificates listing malnutrition-related causes, medical records spanning generations. The weight control system hadn't started with our fathers. It was an inheritance, passed down like a cursed heirloom. This discovery shifted everything. The men weren't just abusers. They were victims too, raised in the same system, taught that controlling women's bodies was love. It didn't excuse their actions, but it explained them. Breaking the cycle meant more than just escaping. It meant ensuring it never started again. Some women began meeting with their husbands in supervised settings, not to reconcile, but to establish new terms. Co-parenting agreements that prioritized their daughter's health. Financial settlements that acknowledged years of unpaid labor. Slowly, painfully, new structures emerged from the ruins of the old. My mother surprised everyone by enrolling in college. At 45, she decided to become a nutritionist, turning her trauma into expertise. My sister started teaching self-defense classes. Other women found their own paths, each recovery as unique as their suffering had been. The men struggled with a new reality. Some adapted, learning to relate to their families without control. Others couldn't change, clinging to their old beliefs even as their world crumbled. My uncle was the worst, showing up at schools, trying to enforce weight checks during his supervised visits. Each violation added to our documentation. Catherine attempted redemption by testifying about the men's continued planning sessions. She revealed they'd formed a support group for wronged fathers, sharing strategies to regain control. Her recordings of these meetings showed them discussing everything from hiding assets internationally to fabricating evidence of maternal neglect. We used this information strategically. Rather than going public, we let the men know we had it. The threat of exposure kept them somewhat contained. They could maintain their public facades as long as they didn't cross certain lines. It was an uneasy detente, but it protected the children. My father made one last attempt at reconciliation. He showed up at my college graduation, flowers in hand, looking older and smaller than I remembered. He'd lost weight himself, the controller now lacking control. He tried to hand me an envelope, claiming it contained an apology and a check for my student loans. I didn't take it. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt, but I didn't call security either. We stood there, father and daughter, separated by more than just space. He finally set the envelope on a bench and walked away. I left it there untouched, a final rejection of his conditional love. The younger girls thrived in their new lives. Free from daily weigh-ins, they discovered sports, art, music. Their bodies grew strong and healthy. They formed friendships based on shared interests rather than shared trauma. Watching them become normal teenagers was worth every legal battle, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. My grandmother lived to see the first wave of divorces finalized. From her wheelchair, she presided over a gathering of free women. No scales, no punishment rooms, no fear. Just 3 generations eating dinner together, existing in their bodies without shame. She passed away that night, her mission finally complete. Her funeral brought unexpected attendees. Women we'd never met approached us with their own stories. Our family wasn't unique. The weight control system existed in variations throughout our extended community. Our escape had inspired others to document, to plan, to resist. The ripples of our rebellion spread wider than we'd known. In her will, my grandmother left instructions for the evidence she'd collected. Rather than releasing it publicly, she wanted it preserved as a warning and a guide. If future generations faced similar control, they'd have a roadmap for resistance. The cycle might try to restart, but it would never again catch us unprepared. 6 months later, I stood in my grandmother's apartment, now properly leased in my name. The cramped space that had sheltered 23 refugees was quiet, housing just me and 2 cousins finishing finishing school. The walls still bore marks from our charts and schedules, reminders of our war room days. My phone rang. Another family reaching out, having heard whispers of our story. They needed help escaping their own weight control system. I gave them the same advice my grandmother had given us. Document everything, build networks, plan carefully. Freedom was possible, but it required patience, strategy, and unshakable determination. The men still circled our lives like distant sharks. They paid their court-ordered support, attended their supervised visits, maintained their public images, but their power was broken. The next generation of girls would never know morning weigh-ins as anything but a strange family legend. I kept one scale in the apartment, displayed like a museum piece. Sometimes the younger cousins asked about it, unable to imagine stepping on it daily, letting a number determine their worth. I told them the truth. That object had once controlled our lives, but we'd learned to control ourselves instead. The weight we'd carried wasn't really about pounds or kilograms. It was about generations of women taught their bodies were problems to be solved, that their hunger was shameful, that their natural forms required constant correction. We'd lifted that weight through collective strength, through refusing to pass it on. My story ends not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet victory. A teenage girl eating lunch without calculating. A mother choosing her daughter's health over her husband's approval. A grandmother's evidence protecting future generations. We'd won by surviving, by documenting, by refusing to let the cycle continue. The scale sits silent now, its power stripped away. We'd learned its secret. It could only control those who stepped on it. Our rebellion succeeded not through grand gestures, but through daily choices. Every meal eaten without guilt. Every pound gained or lost without punishment. Every girl raised to trust her body's wisdom was a victory. Freedom, I learned, wasn't a destination, but a practice. Each day we chose ourselves over their rules. Each day we taught our daughters they were more than numbers. Each day we honored my grandmother's legacy by living the lives she'd fought to make possible. The weight of generations had been lifted, and we were finally free to just be.